Hello, I am Nathan from Honu Sumo Club, and I am one of the hosts and the main researcher for Echoes Sumo History podcast. And I will hand it over to Jake to introduce himself before we kind of come back to what we're going to talk about tonight.
Were you surprised we were starting a podcast there, Nathan? Or
Yeah, I was like, wait, we're going live?
oh no, oh gosh, oh
What?
yeah.
Yeah, no.
This is Jake of Iowa Sumo and Grand Sumo Breakdown, and I can tell you, I have absolutely never flubbed the intro to any of my podcasts. Not even one time. You say one thing different than normal, and all of a sudden your rhythm is gone. I get that. Absolutely.
Yeah, where'd that go?
It's gone. You
Yeah.
got to embrace it. Just dive in.
And I'm JJ, the dude that's just here hanging out, surrounded by pretty awesome people up here.
And then part of my
How about
awkwardness.
executive producer?
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
I don't know if we've negotiated titles for this show yet, but you know, I
We
think that'd be a good one
haven't.
for you.
But when I do my little echoes chamber, like I'm JJ here, producer from the echoes chamber, like that's what I'm saying. So
There you go. There you go.
weird little commercials. You guys are welcome.
Yep. Thank you.
If you
Yeah,
could
it
give
is a
me
little.
a separate title, I'm all for it. Yeah.
And then this is Tadashi. He's very malleable. He was on my lap, so that was part of the distraction of the intro being flubbed. Is he was being very insistent. So he deserves absolutely no titles. He's just interference creator or something.
Yeah. There you go.
So today we are going to be talking about one of the really interesting aspects of kind of sumo in America and Japan. This one chronologically kind of starts before some of the other stories start and then spans way after. So it kind of bridges over them. And it's the story of two different people, but they both interestingly kind of tell, I don't know, two sides of the same story. Um, we'll see if that's true. I may be misrepresenting it. We'll see. We'll let y'all be the judge of that.
Two related stories that are thematically linked.
Yeah, they're thematically linked. And so hopefully that theme emerges and it makes sense. So it really starts off with, if you look for um, Japanese Americans or the first Americans to do Grand Sumo in Japan, if you search for that, you'll find two people who show up.
Can I
As
flex my nerd muscle one time?
Go ahead.
Is Harley Ozaki? Is that one of them? Is that his
Yes,
name?
indeed.
That's a name that popped up like in the very, very beginning for me when I was just learning about like the more famous guys later, like Akebono, Musashi Maru, etc. Sorry, not etc. Konishiki. You
Yes.
got to say all three of those, then I can say etc.
Yes.
Well,
I
and
think that's fair.
Takamiyama,
That's true. Yep.
who is one of
Man,
my dad's heroes.
I think etc. just gets you in trouble.
You're
Yeah.
right. You're right. And friends. Maybe that's a better way to say it. But yes, I know Harley Ozaki. For whatever reason, that name has stuck in my head from that very beginning research.
Yes.
But yeah, who's the other one?
So the other one is a guy named Joe Hiraga. So we'll kind of go into Joe's story first, and then we'll go to Harley's story. But yeah, these are the two guys who are the most well documented. Now, I've made passing references to before in the series, and we'll talk about it a bit more at the end of this one too. But there are four other names that showed up, and those are ones that I think I definitely want to do future episodes about. But these are two very interesting stories that I did want to kind of tell them together because they do tell kind of two sides of same story. So Joe Hiraga is a kid from LA when he's 19 years old in 1934. So he's very similar age to Bud Mukae, who we've done episodes on, both from LA. Joe Hiraga gets so in the late 1920s, we've talked about how Tochigiyama came through the US and LA. And he was in LA when he was basically asked to go up to some tournaments in Northern and Central California. But while he was in LA, apparently he saw this big giant 13-year-old who's, still had room to grow and said, "Hey, like when that kid's old enough, like, send him on over." And so in 1934, when Joe Hiraga's 19, he does go to Japan and he joins Kasuga no Beya. I and so he goes, there's news coverage about it. This is a picture of him meeting a little bit older, um, Kasuga no Oyakata, former Tochigiyama, the yokozuna, from the mid-20s. And so Joe Hiraga goes to Japan, and unfortunately, just months after getting there, he gets appendicitis and an appendectomy. And this is, mid 1930s. Um, so there's news coverage about this, and he goes in like US papers, and he goes to stay with another guy from LA who now lives in Wakayama in Japan, which is like way like kind of central Western Japan, south of Osaka. So he goes there and to recover from his surgery. And then he does eventually go back to Grand Sumo. But his record just never quite like it just his record isn't that great. Uh,
Sure. He didn't live up to what they thought his potential could have been.
yeah, so he is there for about 2.5 years, but he's not very successful in sumo. Um, don't know if it's because the surgery on his abdomen in the mid 1930s, or if it's just I don't know, something about the physicality or whatever. But he doesn't do that well, and he goes back to LA in early 1937. So one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is I've made kind of references to um, LA in the 1930s and the um, like the LA doyo and everything. And I think in a prior episode I showed like a San Francisco Japantown map.
Yeah.
So LA has a similar thing as part of this whole Japantown Atlas project. So there's this atlas of Little Tokyo in LA. And what's really interesting about this one, so this is the northern part of Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. Um, and if you look right at the corner of Jackson Street and North San Pedro, right at the northwest corner there, in tiny little writing, it says the Sumo Kyokai. So the Sumo Kyokai is right in that building. Yeah, so thank you for the cursor because it's kind of tiny. But right across Jackson Street and like 3 doors down, there's at 133 North San Pedro Street. There's the Tokyo Pool Hall, and that's actually where Joe Hiraga's dad lived. So Joe Hiraga is literally living across the street and 2 doors down from the Sumo Kyokai building.
Yeah, hard not to have your giant teenager get involved in sumo when you live next door.
Yeah. So this is part of why, when Tochigiyama comes through and he's visiting Little Tokyo, like he's just a little like a neighborhood kid, from around the corner. Not even around the corner. It's like 3 doors down.
Mhm.
Um, and so we'll come back to this a little bit later about what happened with Little Tokyo, but one thing I have not been able to find is exactly where the doyo was. Um,
Mm.
Everybody refers to it as the North San Pedro Street Sumo Doyo. And they say like, hey, it's just like across the street and down a few doors from the Union Church. So I think it's right near where that Sumo Kyokai building is, because it doesn't kind of show buildings right around there. So yeah, probably in that vacant space, but not 100% sure. Um,
But the spot that does say Sumo Kyokai, is that for sure just an office front?
so it might be the office front or might be where they also had a practice dojo inside, but
Sure.
clearly like the space where they had the tournaments and everything was a larger space, because they would talk about
Yeah.
hundreds, thousands of people watching sumo there. And in a prior episode, I think we talked about like Charlie Chaplin even watching judo there and being spotted in the crowd.
Yeah,
Um,
so there's some sort of like arena type location somewhere
yeah,
that
yeah,
clearly is just a regular width lot, probably.
yeah. And so later in the episode, we'll talk a little bit about what happens to this part of Little Tokyo. So, we can leave the tab up to kind of come back to it. As that's an interesting story of kind of what happens to the neighborhood after World War II. But that's Joe Hiraga's home neighborhood. Like he always, every address I've kind of seen, especially during this period, is like right in that Little Tokyo area. Um, so that's where he comes back to in 1937, but right around the same time as Joe Hiraga is coming back to America, Harley Ozaki is going to Japan. So Harley
That's
Ozaki,
why I remember him, because he wasn't from the coast or something. I remember seeing like, yeah, he's from Colorado. Like what? How'd that work? Because yeah, in the early 20th century, it was pretty much all the coast, right? For at least
yeah,
for yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go on.
no, no, no,
I'm
yeah,
just remembering it's kind of bringing back memories of like my first year getting into sumo, where I went down all sorts of different rabbit holes that I never really did anything with. And yeah, I'm remembering learning about this guy and being like, some random guy in Colorado ended up in pro sumo. What the heck?
yeah. So his family, I think his dad had first come through like Seattle or something, but then they ended up in Colorado, and he was born in Colorado, um, in a fairly small town outside Boulder, and Boulder at that point was not a huge town. But yeah, he's from Colorado, near Boulder, and he was scouted by a guy who was touring through the U.S. Named Kozen Tsunemichi. And so Kozen Tsunemichi sees him, and when he was 17 years old, he was only 180 pounds, but we've kind of talked about how that was still kind of passing for big at that point.
Right.
But he was 6'2".
Mm,
So, tall by even today's standards, but very tall for a Nikkei guy,
yeah.
of that era.
Did
Um,
he like do sumo? Did he do other
no,
sports? Is it just that's a Japanese guy that's big? He should do sumo? Is that like the whole thing?
apparently, like,
Huh.
yeah. So now there might be more that we find out, and I'll get to that. We may find out more, but right now we don't know more.
Sure.
Um,
That's
so I'll talk about that.
tantalizing, but I will allow you to
Yeah,
move
yeah,
on without
and we will,
elaborating.
yeah, we will talk about it later in this episode
Okay, good.
about both why we don't know more, but how we could find out a lot more, which it's just really, really cool. There are a couple different conflicting scouting stories about him. Like there's contemporary newspaper articles, but then there's also kind of stories later about how it happened. So I'm not sure 100% which is true. 'Cause the other thing I noticed from a lot of these newspapers at the time is sometimes details will get scrambled. Like remember, it's pre-internet. Like it might
Sure.
be one reporter in one city calling somebody at the bureau in another city saying like, "Hey, what do you know?" And it's like, "Oh, I think the guy was named this." And
Yeah,
so
and the reporter is a guy who's only seen like 2 or 3 non-white people in his life, so he probably spells stuff wrong too, so who knows?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, these are from Japanese papers. So,
Oh, I'm sorry,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, but sometimes there are issues with transliterations of names. So there's different ways to like write out Chinese characters, right? The
Sure.
kanji. So sometimes like there might be something in a Japanese section of a newspaper that has a name a certain way, and they might print it in the English language papers where the transliteration or the translation is slightly different. Like it's just, yeah, different ways of showing the Chinese characters.
You
So
definitely yeah, sorry to interrupt,
no,
but, like,
but
that's why if you try to have Google translate a Japanese newspaper article for you and it's got sumo terms in it, a lot of the times you get gibberish back.
Yeah,
yeah,
Like,
it's a
instead of
complete
saying
disaster.
my favorite example was always, instead of saying "Yokozuna Kisano Sato," they would always they would like, a Google translated article would say something about the rope of the hometown or something like that. Something about Kisano Sato's kanji, like, relates to hometown or where you're from or something like that, right?
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. It's
So
from
Google had no
Kisei.
idea what to do with that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yep, yep.
I think
So,
we
yes.
we were just having a hiccup with that with, Hoshoyuru, because
Oh,
his name translates to something else, and we're like, that was not right."
Yeah, like there's a cool way to read it, which is how it's supposed to be, right? Which is like something rising dragon, I think. I know
Mhm.
Ryu is dragon, but like yeah, there's enough different readings that if a different person who's not familiar with sumo terminology specifically might not recognize that, oh, it's a shikona. Of course you'd use the badass version of what this means,
Right.
as
right.
opposed to, something mundane or just off-putting or yeah, unnatural there.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of, like, punning that happens and things like that, where it's like, "See, it can mean this and this, it could be read this other way," and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff too, so, yeah. So, yeah, so because of that, there's, like, little conflicting details about his recruitment story, but this picture I like because I think it was taken in Hawaii during a stop across to Japan. So he
Hmm.
got recruited in Colorado, takes the train west, and there's a stop off in, Honolulu, and he, has a picture taken with a lei around his neck, like, on a little tourist stop with this hat. And he's also fairly easy to spot in these pictures because I mean, he's a, pretty tall, thin guy, but also he has this mole on his left eyebrow.
Oh,
So,
that's not yeah, I assume that
yeah,
was an
yeah.
artifact of the image.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So,
real quick, what year are we talking again?
1937.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah. So 1937 is when he goes over. So he goes and he joins Dewa no Mibeya, which is still huge. The super beya of like hundreds of wrestlers. And so he joins there and he actually does really well in sumo. Not like, crazy well, but he never, ever has a losing record after
Wow.
going.
Whoa,
Yeah.
okay.
So yeah, he gets Kakikoshi, yeah, like every time has a winning record.
Hmm,
Kachikoshi. Every tournament. So he slowly climbs up the Banzuke over the course of the years. And then, but slowly, like climbing up the ranks. Um, so we'll come back to his story a little bit more. But by World War II, he's getting into Maegashira. Um, so yeah, so he does well in sumo. He does really well in sumo. Um, so meanwhile, Joe Hiraga, I think I've made passing references kind of going back to him in the late 1930s. When he comes back to LA in 1937, he starts coaching the LA team with Bud Mukai. So he, after he comes back from Japan, though he wasn't successful in Grand Sumo, there's stories about how um, uh, he's um, like I think they call him like a sumo fixture and stuff like that. So there's just references to him being a pro sumo wrestler who'd recently returned, and so he starts coaching the LA team. And this is right before that 1937 Kingakudan tour. So then during the summer of 1937, Joe Hiraga is still in the U.S. Um, and when Bud Mukaye comes back to LA, Joe Hiraga and Bud Mukaye are the two coaches of the LA team. Bud Mukaye is the star wrestler and the captain of the team, and Joe Hiraga is the coach. Um, and so the two of them, we talked about this a little bit in, when we talked about Bud's story, but the LA team goes to all the tournaments they can in San Francisco and Fresno. And then in 1938, so a year and a half after Joe Hiraga starts coaching, the Southern California team actually wins the California All State Championships. And Bud Mukai even defeats Mitsuga Hamanaka, who was the California Yokozuna at the time. But this is a picture of that 1938 tournament that includes three different guys. One is Yoshio Ishida, who's from LA, and so part of that LA team. And he won um, the third division. And then the middle guy is Takeo Kunishige of Fresno. He won the top division, the A division. Um, and then Yoichi Mori of Sacramento won the B division. Um, so these three guys won um, their respective classes in that all-state tournament, the individual prizes. So that's interesting that Bud Mukai, though he defeated the um, California Yokozuna, he didn't necessarily win his division, but he captained the team to victory. So it's another thing about like how these tournaments were organized. That's kind of interesting about how the prizes were awarded as far as different classes and everything, because it didn't seem to have to do with weight class as much as kind of experience and age class. So people would get promotions and then they would compete within that class.
Sure.
But how Bud Mukai fit into that is a little like harder to figure out. Like kind of looking at some of these other stories and who was given, the medals for different classes. So yeah, Joe Hiraga is coaching this team. The newspaper articles credit the kind of teamwork and combination of um, Bud Mukai's kind of frontline leadership and Joe Hiraga's overall coaching to bring the Southern California team to winning the All-State tournament in 1938. So these two guys are Bud Mukai and Joe Hiraga are coaching together. One other thing this is totally squirrel just going back in time with Joe Hiraga is one thing that's really interesting about Joe Hiraga and the Banzuke in sumo is he is the first foreigner to have his foreign shushin listed on the Banzuke.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there probably were other, kind of like Koreans and things like that in sumo, but they weren't listed. Or if they were Nisei, they're hard to find as possible Nisei because they would often give their parents shushi, like province.
Just
So
for people less familiar with the vocab, the
yeah.
Bansuke itself, like the official one where it's all kanji and it's just everybody's name on one sheet of paper, it'll have your name like biggest, like that's like for an individual, their spot on the Bansuke will say their name, I believe their the heya that they fight under, and then where they are from.
Mhm.
And where they're from is generally like prefecture or town or whatever, right? It's like the place that they came from.
Yeah.
And for example, I know Takayasu, Mitaki might be the only two I can think of off the top of my head, who are one parent is Japanese, one parent is not, but they count as Japanese in terms of what gets listed on the Bansuke for where they're from.
Mhm.
And I know that at least for early Americans, I do remember back when I was looking for Harley Ozaki, for example, if I remember right, was he listed as Japanese?
So he was listed as being from Fukuoka. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
But Joe Hiraga is listed as a foreigner, which is the first official time that shows up on the Bansuke.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing about him. Sorry to kind of go back, in time on that one, but yeah, yeah. So that's an interesting thing about these guys. And so these guys, yeah, just really interesting. So they're, both wrestling or, participating in sumo, but on opposite sides of the Pacific. And they kind of stay in that spot. So Toyonishiki, so that's the wrestler name for Harley Ozaki. So Toyonishiki Kiichiro. These are pictures of him, in his yukata, and then another one in his keshomawashi.
Hashimoshi. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I told the co-hosts before starting that I've had a tiring day. So if my
Yeah.
brain just not just chasing squirrels, but I don't even know words.
Becoming the squirrels. Yeah.
Yeah, what are words? Um, so yeah, Keshomashi. Um, so yeah, so this is a picture of um, Kiichiro. Um, that's his Japanese name that he had from birth. Harley Kiichiro Ozaki, and then Toyonishiki is his shikona. So this picture is from the Japanese American National Museum, and it was tantalizingly donated to the Japanese American National Museum in 1997.
That recently.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Wonder where it was.
Yeah. Where
Like,
was it sitting for 50 years? 60.
It was It was his.
Uh,
As
Yeah.
in he was around that long?
Hmm.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So we'll get a little bit into his life. Um, so the other thing that's interesting about a newspaper, there's a newspaper reference in 1941 uh, in San Francisco, the Shinsekai Asahi Shimbun. And that one talks about how Harley Ozaki is one of three Nisei who are wrestling in Grand Sumo at that time. Um, which is another interesting, so like March of 1941. So Harley Ozaki, and then there's a guy from Hawaii, and then another guy from the mainland. So Yoshimi Imai is one guy, and Oshiro Junichi. Um, anyway, yeah. But that may be a weird translation because that many eyes in the middle seems weird to me, but that's just
Sure. Do we
anyway.
know, are we looking into those other 2 guys, their past
Yeah,
as well
we
here?
will, not necessarily in this episode, but,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, so,
They're
definitely
on the docket for further research.
yes,
Fair enough.
yes. And one of these guys was pretty young. So Yoshimi Imai was from LA, and he was born in 1925. So when this article aired, like, he was really young.
Sure.
So 15? Yeah, about to turn 16. Um, so yeah, both these guys and, yeah, Junichi was from Hawaii. Yeah. So and Yoshimi Imai was from LA. So yeah, these guys are really interesting figures. Um, and so Toyonishiki though um, is in Japan all the way through. So he's a U.S. citizen living in Japan in 1941 when the war breaks out.
wow.
Yikes. And another piece of context there is Japan doesn't allow dual citizenship, right? So he is only an American citizen at this point.
So I don't remember how it worked at that point.
Oh, is that not
Um,
necessarily the same
Yeah,
back then?
so
Okay.
we can talk about it a little bit just now, because it's coming up and it doesn't really make a difference whether we talk about it now or in the future. But so he's there, he's in Grand Sumo. He stays in Grand Sumo. He continues to have a winning record until 1944. And in 1944, he drops off the Banzuke, he disappears, and that's because he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army.
Whoa.
Yikes.
So he's a U.S. citizen, but then he's drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. And when you get drafted and you're getting inducted, you have to swear loyalty to the emperor. As soon as that happens, he loses his U.S. citizenship.
Hmm.
Now, people may not know about it till after the war, but he immediately loses his U.S. citizenship, whether he knew about it at the time or not. But based on the decision making of other people who were talking about this, they were aware of it, like other Kibei, so Nisei, who were in Japan for some length of time, and some got stuck there during their war. During an earlier episode, I think we talked about Harry Fukuhara, and if anybody hasn't watched the episode about with Jim McNaughton, Harry Fukuhara was a Kibei guy who came back to the US in 1940-41 knowing the war was about to break out and he did not want to get stuck in Japan. Um,
Sure.
but three of his brothers got stuck in Japan,
Yikes.
and his mom, and they lived in Hiroshima.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And
Yikes.
yeah, and one of his older brothers did die of radiation sickness a few
Yeah.
months after.
Oh,
And Harry
God.
Fukuhara. So that's Harry Fukuhara's story. But like Kibei, who were in Japan in the late 30s, especially 1940-41, they kind of knew the decisions they were going to be having to make.
Right.
Yeah,
You know,
like we saw in that newspaper from last episode, like, it was a matter of when, not if, at that time period, right?
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, Toyonishiki was there, but I think a lot of people didn't know exactly when it was going to happen, and so he was in Japan, stuck in Japan, unable to come to the U.S., and he continued wrestling for the first, 2.5 years of the war, or two and change. Um, And then after he gets drafted, initially he just goes into kind of a regular unit, but then they figure out like, oh, he's fluent in English. Um, so he eventually gets moved to a special assignment, kind of like monitoring, I think, American like radio
Mhm.
transmissions and stuff. So to kind of use his language skills. And that's how he, kind of ends his sumo career at that point. But this is, still only about a year and a half before the end of the war, and he's still a fairly young guy, late 20s. Um, Meanwhile, on the Pacific side, sorry, on the California side, going back to Joe Hidaga, this is some stuff where I found out a little bit more since we conducted our interview with Jim McNaughton. So if anybody sees that interview, we talk about Joe Hidaga a little bit. So I found these FBI cables from December 7th, 1941, and on a list of people who were apprehended on Pearl Harbor Day is Shoji Hidaga. That's Joe Hidaga.
Hmm.
So he was arrested, even though he's a U.S. citizen, on that day. And then a little less than a week later, like 5 days later, the FBI sends a cable from the LA office to headquarters in Washington, D.C., saying, hey, we've confirmed this guy's a U.S. citizen, but he's still in custody. So he's still being held. Um, at Previously, I wasn't sure what happened between this point, and what happens when the mass removal begin in the spring of 1942. But I've since found out that he did go to an assembly center. So he was released at some point in between this arrest and spring of 1942. So he's released at some point. Not sure when.
Well, released in the sense that he is not personally in custody by law enforcement. He's now just in general racially in
Well,
under arrest. Yeah,
well,
I know
he
what you mean though. It's this stuff is talking about him as an individual is being held.
yeah, well, and then he gets released back into the community
Right.
for
Mhm.
There's a gap. There's a gap between the two events.
yeah. So
Okay,
between December and then when the mass removals and reporting to camps happens in like April, May of 1942, he's probably out of custody out in the community.
gotcha. Okay, I think I'm caught up then.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's weird, and these timelines are all, um, yeah, strange. And so, like, there's a gap now, but I don't know exactly how long. Um, so he goes to the Turlock Assembly Center. So that's where he fills out a draft card. And then, but written on the top of his draft card is Turlock Assembly Center. So that's the assembly center that he was sent to, just like Bud Mukaye went to Santa Anita. Um, Joe Hidaga went to Turlock. And then from there, he does end up moving to other camps. But here's where things start getting really interesting with Joe Hiraga, especially in like the context of some of the other people we're looking at. Is um, he goes to Gila River initially, so that's the same place that Bud Mukaye went to, but Bud Mukaye volunteered from there to go into the military intelligence service. Joe Hiraga is at the Gila River camp in Arizona. And then he how much do you guys know about the loyalty questionnaire from 1943?
I think we covered it vaguely in a prior episode, right? It's just basically renounce everything Japanese, prove you're American, then we'll go easy on you.
Yeah, and if you say so, it was these two questions basically saying, will you serve in whatever way you're, ordered or asked, and will you renounce any loyalty to, the Emperor of Japan? And if you think of all the permutations of those questions, but of those two questions, but also all the different reasons why you might, it gets really complicated.
Oh yeah.
especially for a Nisei young man, right, whose parents are in a camp with him. Um, I did forget to mention, Joe Hiaga's dad died not long after his return to the U.S. So, but he and his mom went to a camp, and then I think he had some other family he was in the camp with too.
Okay.
So Joe Hiraga, um, he answers no, no to those questions. So he says he will not serve and he will not forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. Um, and then initially, um, some of the records from 1944 show even that he was considering renunciation of US citizenship.
Hmm.
Yeah, and he gets sent to the Tule Lake camp up in Northern California, way northeastern California. So we talk about this a little bit, and I think our interview with Brian Nia that we're going to put up, I think um, early this week, is after recording, not live. Um,
Probably
so
out by the time you're listening, right?
yeah, so on that one, um, Tule Lake was a camp that had a really high proportion of people who answered no, no. And then when they're then sorting people between these 10 war relocation authority camps around the country, if you've already got a really high proportion of people somewhere that you're not going to send anywhere else, you just keep them there and then you move people from other camps to that place. Like just logistically, it's simpler.
Yeah, sure.
So Tule Lake became huge, like almost 20,000 people in just that one camp.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, and a lot of them were people who initially were considering either renunciation of their US citizenship, or they were Issei who were going to repatriate to Japan after the war.
Like our guy
Uh,
from the last episode.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Joe Hiraga is there at Tule Lake during the war, considering renunciation of his US citizenship. Um, so what's interesting is that then in late 1945, he appears to change his mind after the end of the war. But this picture that's up here shows a sumo tournament at Tule Lake. There were several. There are actually a lot of pictures. I mean, a lot, as in three or four that I've been able to find of sumo at Tule Lake. And previously, a lot of the kind of conventional wisdom is that sumo really only continued in camps like Tule Lake. But we've seen pictures from Gila River, Amachi, Colorado. Sumo was happening in other camps too. Um, but definitely kind of a stronger sense of attachment to like really explicitly like Japanese martial arts culture in Tule Lake. So there was um, a lot of that in Tule Lake.
Perhaps tied to the generalization that these might be the people that are more tied to Japanese culture for one reason or another.
Yeah, yeah. So in general, like there was, quite a bit of kind of diversity within the camps. We've referred to it, and I think in earlier episodes, but George Takei's graphic novel about his childhood in um, the concentration camps talks about his time at Tule Lake. And there was a division within the population there because just as the US government sorted all the no-nos into one big camp, didn't necessarily mean everybody wanted to do the same thing, and they were making some really kind of complicated choices as individuals and families.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and I think like George Takei, for example, his mom was Nisei, so already a U.S. citizen, and he was Sensei. Whereas on his dad's side, he was a Nisei, and his dad was a Japanese citizen and couldn't become a U.S. citizen. So the family chose to repatriate, and his mom was going to renounce her US citizenship and
Hmm.
go back to Japan after the war. But a lot of people, as World War II ended in late 1945, changed their mind. We talked a bit in our last episode about kind of the devastation in Japan at the end of the war. And that wasn't a place a lot of people wanted to return to. Like they knew Japan was in ruins. So a lot of people did last minute appeals of their citizenship renunciation or repatriation. And a lot of it saying like we were having to answer these questionnaires in 1943, not knowing what the world was going to bring,
Yeah.
in camps and with US citizen, like it was under duress. And so there were appeals that happened
Yeah,
of
that situation of, like, if one spouse doesn't have the option, the other spouse, I don't yeah, like, I can't imagine the difficulty of being in that situation where it's like, I am being given a potential out that my spouse does not have.
right.
Do I and 0 0 blame on my part for being like, "Answer whatever you gotta do to keep your family in one place."
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
whether or not that's genuine, because, like, yeah, like you said, at the end of the war where it's like, maybe we're starting to see the opportunity for us to leave these camps, go back, start a life somewhere. Am I still gonna be punished for those answers that I gave that were only for the sake of keeping my family together? That's horrible. That
yeah.
sucks.
Yep. Yeah, and families, in all these camps, were having to make these, judgment calls. Parents for their children, and adult children needing to decide, do I need to stay in a camp and help take care of my parents, or do I go volunteer in the military service, or I'll happily serve, but not as long as my parents are in camps, right? All these sorts of kind of understandable
Oh, yeah.
um, decisions that people are having to make, right? That are complicated and yeah, and that are partially highly individual and partially very, like these are family decisions.
Mhm,
Because you're not just locking up individuals in these camps. Um, so I think one of the things that's interesting, and I'm not sure exactly what it tells us, is that Joe Hiraga doesn't leave Tule Lake until March of 1946.
hmm,
So he and Tule Lake closes like a week, 2 weeks after Joe Hiraga leaves. And from what I've heard of kind of descriptions of people who were there at that point, it was like a ghost town. It
mm,
was very few people left. Um, and so he's there, like he's among the last people to leave Tule Lake. And then Joe Hiraga goes back to LA, as far as I can tell, because later kind of phone books and census records show him living in LA after that. So yeah, and I'm not kind of sure about that stuff, about what it kind of means, what it tells us,
mhm.
and I'm not even sure where to start um, as far as speculation. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, um,
I can see so many different, like, I don't know, we kinda saw how volatile or spur of the moment the decisions were in starting the camps, and I imagine that there's probably a lot of the same sort of large scale bureaucratic nightmare as far as emptying the camps too. Like, how do they prioritize who's released and when, and how do they determine,
mhm,
to what level you are released or where you can be transported to, or all these other things that I'm not saying I necessarily sympathize with the organizers of the system, but, like, it's still an enormous task, and
yeah,
the fact that it took 6 plus months after the war ended to close these camps means that there's got to have been a lot of red tape that they were. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know, if unless there's any other records that we stumble across, like, I don't know that we'll ever find out why one guy versus different guy was in a camp longer.
yeah, and it's really hard to tell sometimes, but sometimes like we know from other families. So there were a lot of families that went to Chicago, and then the Twin Cities were two big areas. Minnesota was overall very welcoming of the Nikkei community relocating from the camps. The governor of Minnesota very early in the war welcomed and allowed like Camp Savage to be placed there. Many other governors all over the US said, no, we don't want, I won't throw out the racial slur, but we don't want,
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
From a completely unbiased perspective, I will say Minnesota generally does rule. So it's so yeah. I mean, it's always been a place that's like I imagine it's similar to why Canadians are nice. It's like this place is just the inverted temperature version of hell. You can come here and we're all in it together. Yeah, everybody's welcome. just just huddle closer for body heat and we'll all be cool.
so this is weirdly, this is totally a squirrel. So in Japan, in the winter, there's this thing where you have like a little coffee table, like a little table you sit around, and then
Oh, yeah, yeah.
like the futon thing, and you have the heater underneath, and you stick your legs under it, and you wear like a nice coat, but then you just stick your legs under the nice warm blanket, and like tiny children and like cats like just live under there during the winter.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but I is that a thing in Minnesota? It should be.
I don't think so.
What a loss. Fire
This is
hazard, but you know.
probably this is probably a foreign idea to you guys, but like the older the house, the more likely there is a freestanding wood burning stove. Like not a fireplace built into the wall, but like an actual like cast iron
Yeah,
thing
yeah, yeah.
that's a foot away from the wall. That's probably the closest equivalent. Put a fire in there and it just radiates heat in all directions, and that's how you keep your little log cabin warm.
Yeah, yeah. We weirdly had a log cabin like that in Nagano in Japan that we would
Yeah.
spend some time in during the winter, and somebody had shipped one of those from America.
Oh, there you go. That's the trick.
Which shipping a cast iron stove from America. Anyway, um,
That ain't going UPS ground.
woo,
That's some surcharges on it. That's
yeah.
gonna be heavy.
But yes, those things are magical.
No shit, it's not going ground. It's across an ocean. Terrible joke. I take that one back. I apologize for
Tried.
that
You
joke.
tried. You tried. There might have been a little bit of UPS there, a little bit, just a little bit to get it to the boat.
I
Yeah,
I if I had an ego, I'd say edit that joke out. But you know what? No, let it stand. That's part of the experience.
yeah, yeah. We all have humbling experiences. It's okay. We started the whole series because of yeah, uh,
Foot
yoga JJ. So yeah, um,
Yoga JJ
yeah.
putting his foot in his mouth.
Yep. And then I've done that plenty of times, so I just don't even count. They're not even memorable. They happen so often. So,
Anyway,
uh,
so that's how you stay warm in Minnesota. Back to whatever we were talking about for you.
so anyway, I think they're magical wonderment, but that's because I'm attached to them from my childhood, and everything from childhood was better, right? Anyway, so another interesting thing about the little Tokyo that Joe Hiraga returned to is it was very different. Like, the war, the removal of all the Japanese Americans from little Tokyo, but also just massive shifts in population changed LA. And so as the decades passed on, so earlier we showed a map of little Tokyo, and it showed North San Pedro Street and kind of Jackson, which is where the Sumo Kyokai, basically Jackson Street just gets erased. And
Yeah,
what
I don't
happened?
even recognize the names of the roads on this one. Is this
Yeah,
the same location?
this is the same location, and Judge John Iso Street is North San Pedro Street. So
Oh,
earlier, I don't remember if we talk about it much in the Bud Mukai episode, but in our interview with Jim McNaughton, we talk about John Iso, and John Iso was this guy who helped really create and run the Military Intelligence Service Language School. Becomes a major in the army, but post-war he becomes a judge, and he is North San Pedro Street in that little stretch of Little Tokyo is renamed Judge John Iso Street.
that's cool.
And then the block to the west of it, where the doyo used to be, and the Sumo Kyokai building, get demolished through eminent domain and turned into the LAPD headquarters,
Hmm.
which has since been demolished. And there's a couple other LAPD buildings on that block. But right now, where Jackson Street used to be, and where the Sumo Kyokai building and the doyo, it's a vacant lot right now. There's like an LAPD parking structure entrance there. Um, And if you kind of look at Little Tokyo then and now, there's really only one spur of that one main intersection between San Pedro and then I think it's First. Um, there's one edge of it that's like east that goes from kind of San Pedro to where the Japanese American National Museum is. That's kind of original buildings. Almost all the other buildings in that area have been demolished, and it's
Wow.
like parking structures and um, uh, yeah, this whole neighborhood has just completely changed, and there's an ongoing struggle in Little Tokyo with multiple community organizations to, when the city of LA demolishes a city building, like, how does it get repurposed? How do you keep the character and heritage of Little Tokyo alive? But you don't
Yeah.
necessarily want to just rebuild the buildings and make it, Little Tokyo Disneyland. Like, um, and that's an ongoing, like, kind of conversation and struggle right now where not everybody's on the same page within the community about what will be best for the community. Um,
I
but it
mean,
was
if we
devastating.
if we look at the neighborhood itself, they have, what is that? Rafa
Yeah,
Shimpo?
Rafushimpo, yeah.
Yeah, which is like one of the oldest, uh, what is it called? Newspapers, Japanese newspapers around
Yep,
from America. So,
yep, it's
like,
still there.
that's historic.
Yep, yep.
Wow.
There are a lot of buildings, businesses that are still there, but probably only about probably less than a quarter of the original. So the
That's a
businesses,
topic all on its own that send
yeah.
these people off to camps and then eminent domain their businesses. That's a lot to unpack there for sure.
Yeah, there's
Ooh,
a lot to,
capitalism. Ooh, capitalism.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot
maybe no
to unpack.
comment if we don't want to go down a another entire rant.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think I told JJ this, like, early on, like, when I saw, like, the Google Street View images of what's there now that used to be this vibrant neighborhood, I spent a couple days, like, angry. I
Yeah,
spent
this is an entire genre of research that I think would if you yeah, I I don't know. I don't think we need to beat a dead horse, but like if you study this stuff enough, yeah, you should be angry. If you are studying it properly, you come away angry and sad.
yeah, and I think it does say something about when, through some sort of demonization, you remove a whole population from a rich, vibrant neighborhood, and you think you're helping yourself or the country or the neighborhood. What
Yeah.
you're left with decades later is vacant lots.
Pretty cool.
Tulsa.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Right.
beat me
Greenwood.
to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Greenwood. Yeah. Vibrant neighborhoods.
uh
And
Berlin even? Like this is
Yeah,
not something
yeah,
that is an isolated incident. This is
yeah.
something that is like yeah, I man, I'm glad you brought up Tulsa because
I
like that was
mhm.
one of the yeah, the story of Tulsa, the if you don't know what we're talking about and that doesn't make you angry just hearing about it, you could even watch the new Watchmen show
yeah,
on HBO. Like you can
I have
even
not
have
watched
like
that yet.
fun pop culture and learn about good history. So
true,
Mhm.
a lot
true.
of stuff out there for
Great
learning
watch.
about why this is not a unique situation to dive in and cannibalize this space once it becomes available, quote unquote.
Yeah, and yeah, just the most striking thing from this one is just like nobody won from that. Like nobody won.
No, no.
Like you just keep shooting yourself in the foot, and it's very short sighted. And yeah, it I feel sad.
And here
Um,
we are 80 years later with less history and vacant lots. Yeah.
yep, yep.
All around
Uh,
sad. I like I said though, like we don't need to beat a dead horse because that's not what we're here for in our thesis statement, but it's certainly something that is a factor in the story that we're looking to tell.
so yeah, and kind of going back to Joe Hiraga's story, he goes back to LA. This is where he seems to live. He ends up actually living for a little bit up in East LA, strangely, just like a block or so away from where my wife was born in East LA. So, uh, yeah. And but then, little Tokyo lives in LA, and he dies in LA, and I think 1979, about then, living in LA. But other than kind of some telephone book records and things like that, there's not a whole lot about him at that point, um, about his later life. It's also like what's publicly available, just because like there's restrictions on what things can kind
Yeah.
of be released within what might be somebody's lifetime, like when records become public.
I
So
it's frustrating though, it's just like Bud, like, if you're not getting into the newspaper, it's not like there's a Facebook page for us to scroll through and see, like, when he went on vacation to wherever or something,
yeah,
there's just all this information that's just lost to time because that it wasn't recorded anywhere.
yeah,
But similar to Bud, though, it sounds like, we have basic census records or what have you, or the
hmm,
date he got married for Bud in Bud's case, but, like,
yeah,
that's it.
yeah. And Joe Hiraga, Shoji Hiraga, yeah, he's buried with his parents in LA, um, and no children, as far as I can tell, either. No descendants. Um, so going back to Toyonishiki's story, Harley Ozaki's story on the other side of the Pacific, is, I don't know, for me, like these stories, the way they just both guys get trapped on either side of the Pacific by the war,
Yeah.
and had to make really, really difficult choices at that point. And it is worth pointing out that to a certain extent, what happened with all the Nikkei and what Joe Hiraga had to choose, he had some choice. Imperial Japan, there was not much choice. Um, you're on an island, you can't relocate anywhere, you're drafted, you are swearing loyalty to the emperor, you're losing your US citizenship, you are trapped. There is not a lot of choice.
Sure.
And all the choices are even worse. So for Harley Ozaki. Um, so Harley Ozaki, at the end of the war, um, so this is more a question for you guys, and we can edit it out if it's awkward. But I found a little video on the interwebs that is this little captioned Japanese video. It's like 5 minutes long, and it's about Harley Ozaki. And you can turn
Hmm.
on the English subtitles and watch it. Um, so I don't know, we could do like a weird reaction video or something. I don't know. Is that a thing? And if
I
it's clunky and it doesn't work, we don't need to keep it in.
No, let's let her rip. Let's see what happens.
チャンネルです。2025年1月場所、元横綱武蔵丸、武蔵川親方の王位、光武蔵が初土俵を踏みました。アメリカ人力士の入門は光武蔵の兄である元幕下武蔵国。2013年7月場所初土俵、2019年9月場所引退。以来です。近年はモンゴルや東欧出身の外国人力士が多いですが、アメリカ人力士は外国人力士の先駆けであり、1990年代には多くのアメリカ人力士が活躍していました。史上初の外国人力士もアメリカ人力士で、1934年1月場所に初土俵を踏んだカリフォルニア州出身の日系2世。
Oh no, we lost our
元富
subtitles.
田平賀でした。
Oh, they're back.
There we go.
外
There
国
we
人
go.
力士、アメリカ人力士で初めて関取になったのはコロラド州出身の日系2世。
So
元
Colorado
平幕
Shu
豊
is
錦でした。
Colorado
史上初のアメリ
state,
カ人
state
関
of
取は
Colorado.
元関は桁神山であると言われることが多いですが、これは豊錦が父親の出身地である福岡県出身と
Ah,
い
there
う
you go.
扱いだったた
He
めで
wasn't
す。
treated
今
as
回
a
は豊錦
foreigner,
につい
quote
て紹
unquote.
介します。豊錦の父、尾崎清太郎は福岡県築城郡で生まれました。1899年に26歳で農業移民としてハワイに渡
He
り、
was born at the age of
1906年に
26.
兄の幾太郎が
Oh,
農
there
園
we
を
go.
営んでい
Okay.
たコロラド州に移
That
住
made
し
more
ました。
sense then.
豊錦は1920年に清太郎と妻は佐の7人兄弟の次男として生まれました。本名はハーリー尾崎喜一郎です。喜一郎はしっかりした骨格で背が高く、スポーツ万能でした。そして、アメリカを訪れた広島の本願寺の僧
Yeah,
侶
this is
の
all
目
the
に留まり、
translation
父の
issues
相
that I
撲好き
mentioned
もあって
before.
角界に
Yeah,
入る
the
ことに決め
translation
ます。
issues are wild because it's talking a little
1937
bit
年3
about
月
his
17歳
dad,
で来日
but
し
Yeah,
ました
I think
I'm
really
getting the
talking
の
gist,
about
米
I
の注
guess.
目を浴び、
Yeah.
yeah,
玉錦、双葉山、前田山から勧誘を受けましたが、 福岡の代議士の仲介で
Yeah,
は
so
の
he's
海部屋に
going
入門し
to,
ました。
this
1938
is the
年1
era of
月場所に本
Futabayama,
名の尾
right?
崎
After
が初土俵を踏みました。
huge and really helping
1941年
revive
12
sumo.
月8日に太平洋戦争が始まると、アメリカ国籍であることを理由にスパイの
And
疑いをか
remember,
けら
in
れ、
Japan, World
特
War
別高
II,
等
or
警察
rather
の
the
監視
attack
対
on
象に
America
なりました。
happened
アメ
on
リカ国
December
籍で
8th
は巡業も
because of the
困難にな
international
る
date
こと
line.
Ah, good
So that
point.
twelve
Okay.
eight was like, yeah.
1943年夏にアメリカ国籍を放棄して日本国籍を取得しました。1943年1月場所に重量に昇進し、父の故郷である豊前の国、福岡県東部、大分県北西部の豊に錦をつけた豊錦
So
の
yeah,
しこ名を名乗
his
りました。
dad is from
身
this
長
kind of edge of
188センチ
Fukuoka
メートル、 体重
Oita
96kg で、
Prefecture.
長
It's
身と
like
体
at
の
the
バネ
very
を生かし、
northern bit
左
of
四つ
Kyushu,
次より、右るは手投げと速い
near
取り口を
Beppu,
身に
I
つけま
think,
した。
but on the
稽古
Fukuoka
熱心
side.
で貧困法制でした。重量は3場所で
His
通過
father
し、
was Issei, and
1944 年
Harley
5
was
月に入
Nisei.
幕。
Okay.
西前頭に10
Okay,
枚
so
目の
Kyotaro.
で6勝
And
4
we'll talk
敗
a
と
little bit
勝ち
about
越しました。
Kyotaro.
将来は大関と期待されていました。しかし、場所後陸軍に徴兵され、祖国アメリカ
Expect
と
to
戦
become
う
an
ことにな
Ozeki.
りまし
Wow.
た。当初は下
Yeah.
関砲
He
兵
was
部隊
doing
に
really
配
Lot of
well
属
in
してい
promise.
ま
sumo.
したが、
Yeah,
Mhm.
no
近
kidding.
福
I
岡市
brought
参
up
謀
his
部
Sumo
公式
DB
反対
page.
罪、
I'd recommend checking
米
that out
軍
if
の無
you're
線を傍受し
following
婚
along
約
with
しま
this.
した。バッテーはアメリカで徴兵されヨーロッパ戦線に送られており、兄弟が敵味方に分かれて戦うことになりました。終戦後は体力が戻らず、生活のことも考えて引退
I
し、
wonder which
進
general
駐
that
軍の通訳にな
caricature
りました。
is.
初土俵から引退まで負け越したことはありませんでした。1950年からは、富岡
Okay,
八
well,
幡
that was a
軍隊団で
mistranslation.
同様、
Yes.
歩兵兵士
Never
官と
lost a
しました。
single match? I
日
don't
本
think
で
so.
の軍撃ター
No.
ゲットとなり、
No.
アメリカに
Never
渡
won
り
a
コ
single
ロラド州の
tournament.
家族と
There
never
it
生
lost
活
a
に来た
single
のは
Yeah.
tournament.
戦後
Yeah.
15年を経た
Never had a Makikoshi.
1960年でした。
Yeah.
戦後にアメリカ国籍を再取得しています。
Oh.
1993年に旅館経営を辞め、父の故
Yeah.
郷
So,
築城郡へと移住しました。
the captions are
1998年
talking
9
about
月
how
26
he did
日、
regain his
豊
U.S.
錦は
citizenship in
78歳で亡く
1960,
なり
but
ました。
stayed in
大
Japan.
相撲雑学チ
So
ャンネ
he,
ルをご視聴いただ
a
き
lot
あ
of
りがと
people
う
kind
ご
of
ざいました。
appealed
チャンネル登
this.
録よろしくお願い
So
し
he
ま
ran an
す。
inn in Tokyo.
That
In
that was my last memory of this guy's
Yeah.
story was that he led a, I don't want to say unremarkable, but like an recorded, similar to these other guys that we're talking about. There are no more like major events that we can follow or track in the newspapers other than he ran a ryokan.
Yeah, yeah, and then he eventually did retire and move back to Fukuoka Prefecture, and that's where he died in 1998. So that's shortly before that is when some of those pictures were donated to the Japanese American National Museum. But
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 okay,
uh, I've been corresponding with uh, a archivist at the Japanese American National Museum, and in an email from them, they said, "Oh, hey, we've got a donation, more recent donation that we haven't taken a closer look at. It's from an Issei guy whose son seems to have gone into sumo."
aha, okay. I was gonna say the dates on there line up more with his father, then, right?
Yeah, so we correspond back and forth because I'm like, you know what? There are probably only about half a dozen people, Nisei
Yeah.
in Japan, who
I'm
do
gonna know
sumo.
who you're talking about if you
Yeah,
tell me the name.
and then so their response was like, "Well, that is a small list," and so they
Yeah.
send me more details. They send me more details, and it was a donation by uh, uh, the family of Kiyotaro Osaki, who lived to 105 and died.
Oh, I hadn't done that math. Holy hell.
Yes, and died in San Diego, California.
Hey, isn't that the city where you live?
It is.
What a coincidence. Wow. Wow. Okay. Go
And
on.
so I'm like, wait, what? So then I look at like find a grave, and I find his grave. And it's at Mount Hope Cemetery here in San Diego. So one day I like it's like 10 minutes up the road. So I
Is
just
this your picture?
no, this is
Okay.
from somewhere else, but yeah, I've taken pictures.
You have
Yes.
been there? Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I went and visited, and there's a whole section of this cemetery that is heavily Japanese American.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
kind of on two sides of a street, an intersection in the cemetery. Um, and so yeah. And then next to him, next to Kyotaro's grave, so his the wife Wasa is also there. That's um, Kiichiro, Harley's mom. So
Mhm.
they're both buried there. And then Harley's brother and sister and I think brother-in-law are also buried there, in graves in a row.
Mhm.
And yeah, this whole section of the cemetery starts off. You can see from the older graves, uh, Japanese American, but then this is a legacy of America and redlining in America. That then, as you walk further, you start seeing um, African American graves, Hispanic graves. As there's pictures and names and um, eh, the cemetery started off segregated, right? This is
Mm.
California, right? And this is one of the city cemeteries. Um, yeah, this is very close to home, very close to home. And I don't know, JJ, it's up to you if you want to talk about our trip there, but if you don't
Uh,
want to, that's okay.
yeah, I mean, it's part of the story. So after Keiko, we Nathan was like, "Hey, let's take a field trip." Um, so we hop in the electric vehicle and
The
we
golf
mosey
cart.
on.
No.
Yeah, it's a very nice golf court. So we mosey on over and we start looking and it just so happens that my mother is buried like like literally like 20 feet away
Oh my god.
from this gravesite. So it's like when he was saying it's like all of the others are there. This is literally our space in San Diego. Yeah.
Wow.
So
And I
Eh,
did not know that. I just JJ was like, what is going on here as we're driving into the, cemetery. And
did
yeah,
you, like, feel like, obviously, I imagine you know where your mother is buried, so as he's bringing you closer, you're like, "Are you playing a prank? Like, I know where we're going." Right? Like,
um
how what was that
I
like?
it was definitely a weird experience. Christina was Christina there?
mhm,
Yeah, yeah. So Christina also had the same like, "What is happening?" And then as you're going in, it's a giant cemetery, but you make a right, you make a left, you keep going, and like if this picture was like 3 more pictures, you would see her grave.
Oh my
Um,
god.
which is, like we didn't. I had to take a moment as I was getting outside of the car, and I was like, Nathan, my mom's over there.
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
Yeah,
That
yeah, and that's why I was like,
man,
yeah.
that's powerful. If I may ask, like, how when did she pass? Like, are we talking a city cemetery that's, like, still is it
Uh,
still, like, kind
3
of
years ago.
really? Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, this is still the place. With the rent in San Diego might be high, but burying somebody is extremely high. Um, and when I had to bury her, this was the place that she wanted, but it was so that she was close to her friends. But all of the black people in San Diego that do decide to get buried here, and it was eye opening to find out that I didn't know the Japanese people were also
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
like buried here. You go to a cemetery, you don't really think, you're just kind of going to where you need to go. It's not really sightseeing, it's more visiting a relative. Um,
Yeah.
so when I started looking around, you could see like all of the names that of people that I know around, which was shocking.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then
because Nathan, you mentioned that this was like originally segregated, and like so many things, like when your parents, your grandparents, or whatever, like the people that you know are buried there, then of course there's a pull for you to want to be buried there too. So even if it's not officially segregated, it still kind of maintains that legacy, right? Is that kind of the feel that you got for it?
yeah, I think, I was there right after New Year's, um, which is a big deal and holiday, in the Japanese American community still. So there were people, walking around, leaving, Year of the Snake things around, leaving mochi in front of the graves along with satsuma oranges. Um, People kind of visiting. I know there were, a lot of people from the Buddhist temple that another member of our club had just participated in the mochitsuki, the mochi pounding there. And, I'm walking through the graveyard and I'm seeing, oh, that's so and so's uncle who I just met last week,
Wow.
and so it's one of those things that's so, strange about a place that starts off as an injustice, right?
Hmm.
Separate and unequal, but eventually a community kind of literally grounds itself there in that community, like and where that legacy lives on, and a way to connect to the pioneers of a community. um and so it's this odd mixed legacy where it's just a lot of complicated feelings that I can't even
Yeah, no
scratch the
kidding.
surface of, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is nowhere near the same level of I don't know, depth. But like for me, one thing that was kind of eye opening, cemeteries in general, like even if you take like the history of the injustices out of it, like it's something that is still very humbling because different my closest experience with that kind of humbling just weight, I guess, would be which what is it? Is it in New Orleans? The famous one is
Mm.
St. Louis. What's the I'm forgetting it. What's the major cemetery, the major historical cemetery in New Orleans? Um, God,
Just outside of the French district, right?
yeah. Oh God, what am I? Uh, JJ, help me out. Look it up. Figure out what the name of that famous cemetery is. But like, it's a big part of like the touristy experience. Is like this is the
Mhm.
cemetery that is like contained around like in the middle of town. So it's like there's no room for expansion. In the south,
Yeah,
they have like
it's St. Louis Cemetery.
okay. I'm glad I got
Yeah.
that right. I would have felt really dumb. But but it's simultaneously a thing where like you have Nick Cage has already bought a tomb there because he's very close to New Orleans as a city, and it's like this dopey looking ostentatious pyramid that he's going to get buried in someday, right? And it's like 10 feet tall. It's like, wow, this is such a silly thing. Like, hey, bring all the tourists, let's look at this. And then you turn a corner and there's a man mourning his husband who died a year ago, and
Mhm.
it's like just I don't know. There's definitely something very deep and uniting about the idea of cemeteries, and I cannot imagine how much more that impacts you when you have personal history that's tied to other people's personal history that you didn't even know about. And that's yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of waxing poetic about nothing because I don't have this personal experience that you guys do. But I'm just trying to illustrate like how much I can understand that the history of these places adds so much to the story, and finding I'm just so blown away that Nathan has pulled on this thread and unraveled this sweater all the way to a grave that JJ has walked past, and
Yeah.
that's wild to me that that brings us to the similar to like some of our very first episodes. This history isn't ancient history. This isn't like
Mm.
this isn't like marble statues. This is like This isn't black and white photos even. This is people that were around yesterday, basically.
Yeah, and so there's a few things that are I'm hopeful that in the future we can connect it even further. Um, because one of the historians I was talking to um, get me in um, got me in touch with somebody in Japan who was a TV producer in the 1990s who interviewed Toyonishiki. And there is a TV Tokyo interview and documentary about him from the late 90s. Uh, I haven't been able to find it. I think the rights are copyrighted. We can't show it. Um, but I'm
But we can talk about it.
but we can talk about it a little bit. It exists. And I'm chatting with the producer, and it's really um has it could be very interesting. The stories, because he has Harley Ozaki talked about, his life, his decisions, his life post-war. So unlike a lot of the other people, we have the information. And back to Kiyotaro's diaries. So Kiyotaro's diaries, um, there's 16 volumes of them.
Wow.
They span decades.
Yeah.
They're all written in Japanese. They have them at the Japanese American National Museum. Um, uh, and everybody I've talked to so far about it is like, uh, Kyotaro went to school in Japan in the late Meiji period, and these are handwritten diaries. Japanese has changed so much,
Oh, sure.
and handwritten Japanese and reading it, like, even once I can go and digitize these, it is going to be a task
Sure.
to mine these for gold.
Mhm.
Um, but challenge accepted. Um,
Yeah, no
so
kidding.
so
I
this
know the
might
guy for the task.
so I mean I can't read and write right now, so I might need to learn, but I'm still gonna try, if some like hungry grad student who wants to, go into some weird niche area, wants to take this on and learn, kind of, I don't know, it's not archaic Japanese in the whole scheme of things. Japanese gets way more archaic than 150 years ago. Um,
Sure.
so, but that's a really exciting possibility. Like these exists, they're a 2.5 hour drive away. And there's a lot of it. So that would be a really exciting opportunity to kind of see what that shows. And either way, I think one thing I will say about it is I'm glad that the diaries are there here in America, where just a few years after their donation, there are people wanting to look at them, wanting to study them, wanting to see what stories they have to tell.
Sure.
Um, because I think if they'd gone to Japan, um, probably, you know, Kyotaro's story wouldn't be as interesting. There is interest in Harley Osaki's story in Japan, as you can see from some of the YouTube videos about it and everything. But um, Kyotaro's story might just get lost in Japan. Whereas here's in America, it's a really kind of interesting story. And especially, the Colorado community and, the perspective of a father who was a huge sumo fan and, his son went to, Japan to do sumo and was
Yeah,
successful. And, yeah, just there's a lot, there's a lot that could be in those that's really interesting and will, probably tell us some unexpected things.
totally.
Yeah, but there's also other people, and I hope in future. I talked about Yoshimi Imai from LA, but there's also three other people who are mentioned. Um, so one is a guy named Kiyoshi Obata who went back to Japan with Tochigiyama in 1927, apparently, and then just stayed in Japan and and like the English language Japanese newspapers say he was a secretary at Kasugano-beya. And
I didn't know that was a sumo position.
right. And so, but remember, this is early sumo where, before all these formalized, there's one gyoji, and one yobidashi, and, the oyakata has to be a retired like wrestler. We've talked about how this was a way more flexible world at the time, right?
Yeah.
And
Maybe,
so I
maybe
don't,
secretary was just kind of like team manager, the guy who decides the groceries and does the books or whatever to make sure they got money for food or yeah.
yeah. So I'm really kind of curious about Kyoshi Obata. And then there's two other people, Sadaiji Fukuyama, who wrestled as Fukunishiki out of Kasugano-beya, and then Masashi Tsukamoto, who wrestled as Tsukushigata out of Kasugano too. And they were both in the mid to late 30s. And so they both seem to have come back to the US. And so I think what happened with them once they came back to the US would also be really interesting stories that um, but that's another cool thing about that 1940 history of the Japanese in America, which is what these names are from. That it tripled the list of the number of Nisei who went to Japan to try sumo, right? I think another thing that's kind of interesting about this is just like Takasago Beya became the one that welcomed a lot of Hawaiians starting in the mid 60s, right? And through all the way into the 90s, right? Takasago was the spot. Um, Kasugano-beya seems to be the one, the stable that welcomed a lot of Nisei. Most, other than Harley, went to Kasugano-beya. So that's
Mhm.
another interesting connection with Tochigi-yama coming to America, meeting people, connecting with people, and then promising Nisei would go to Kasugano-beya. So it's another interesting thing about kind of like the Heya world that Heya are so individual in kind of where they recruit from and who they're open to. That is still a thing. It's
Oh,
still
for
a
sure.
thing, right? And so that's really interesting. As much as we think of like sumo as a monolith, like no, it's
Yeah.
so different from stable to stable.
Yeah,
Uh,
Kisano Sato is getting all sorts of attention for like using 20th and later century training methods for sumo stuff, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
video cameras. Wow, crazy.
yeah,
Doing
yeah,
weights, not just doing more sumo matches.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm entertained that like the weights controversy within
Yeah.
sumo is hilarious.
That's
Like,
my favorite one.
Oh, Kanishiki has feelings about
oh,
that.
no.
He had some very strong feelings about that. It was
A
quite funny.
a guy from the '80s has opinions on how we're training right now. I'm shocked. I'm shocked.
Um, it looks like we're at the point where we're wrapping up, right?
Yep.
I do want to say that we are pulling interest from so Kosei reached out to me and he was wondering if he was the first um, sumo wrestler from to come out of SoCal. And I
Okay.
was like, in the modern era, sort of. And then he was like, what does that mean? So this has been a journey for him. He's been watching along
Oh,
and
cool.
kind of seeing who came before him as
Hmm.
he starts out his journey as a sumo wrestler. So everybody, give a watch out for Kosei Imada, a SoCal Open winner. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, great young man. So excited to see him joining Otowayama Beya, right? That's where
I
you
believe
just
so.
went? Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Kakuryu, Yokozuna Kakuryu's stable. So yeah, very excited. He's a nice young man.
All right. And with that, everyone, good night. John Net.
はい、またね。さよなら。
I messed this up again because I pressed the wrong
Awkward.
button.
It's
Yeah.
the closest you'll see
I'm
me to
gonna say it out.
dancing.
Bye bye. Bye. ハード